Alan Locke was 6 years old when he first realized that he wanted to be a sailor in the British Royal Navy. Now, little British kid, he knew he'd have to work really, really hard in order to get there, and so he did. He worked really hard, and by the time he was in his mid-20s, he had achieved his dream of serving aboard a destroyer in the Atlantic Ocean. Late one night, he was trying to read some navigational charts, and he said his eyes were super blurry, like the ink was smeared across the page. So he rubbed his eyes, looked again, still blurry, and thought, well, it's 1 in the morning, I'll go to sleep, tomorrow it'll all be fine. Only the next day, it wasn't fine. So he ended up going to the doctor, and eventually he received a diagnosis that no 20-some-year-old should ever have to get. He was told that he had macular degeneration, a disease that would most likely take his vision. Now, at first, Alan tried to think positively. He told himself, well, maybe the doctor is wrong. Maybe my vision will come back. Maybe I won't lose my dream job. And yet, all the positive thinking in the world didn't stop the inevitable. He did end up losing most of his useful sight, and he did end up losing his job in the British Royal Navy. Now, initially, his friends doubled down on that advice to think positively. They told him to look for the silver lining, to look on the bright side, to not allow any negative thoughts into his mind. But Alan told myself and my co-author, Lee Daniel Kravitz, when we interviewed him for our book, Super Survivors, that the more he tried to think positively, the more depressed he got. He said that it just felt like he was lying to himself and the people that he loved. And he also shared with us that he wasn't really able to move forward again in his life until he gave up on positive thinking, gave it up completely, and instead embraced what he called realistic thinking. He said, for instance, that he needed to admit to himself that he had lost his vision and it wasn't coming back. Doctor after doctor after doctor had told him that he had lost his job and he wasn't getting it back. Advisor after advisor after advisor had told him that. He said only then, grounded in the reality of his situation, could he grieve these losses, and he had a lot to grieve. And then go on to ask himself an incredible forward-looking question, a question that he told us was very important in his healing, and that was, what now? What can I do now to build the best life I can on top of realistically what I'm facing? And he said it was this question that opened him up to set new goals and to put one foot in front of the other again to move towards a better future. Fast forward to the present, he becomes the first legally blind person to row a rowboat across the Atlantic Ocean. He also becomes the first legally blind person to trek across Antarctica, now holding world records and becoming an inspiration to millions and millions and millions of people with visual impairments across the globe. And remember, he told us he didn't do it through positive thinking, he did it through realistic thinking. Look, I think there's no doubting that Alan Locke is a realistic thinker. But I think we can also agree that there's a little something more to his story. This is also quite a hopeful story. So Alan Locke, more than anyone I've ever met, really teaches me at least that true hope, real hope, is grounded in reality. Real hope starts with reality and then builds on it little by little by little. In fact, we could call real hope, if we wanted, grounded hope. And that's what I want to talk to you about today. I'm going to spend a little time talking about what hope is and why it's important in our lives and how it works, but most importantly, how can someone like Alan Locke, who's lived through such dire circumstances, somehow still be hopeful? And maybe we can learn a little bit for ourselves along the way. So neither I, nor Alan, nor my co-author, Lee, are the first people to suggest that real hope is grounded in reality. That honor, at least within the field of psychology, goes to this person right here. This is the late, great C.R. Snyder, one of the founders of the field of positive psychology and a good friend of mine and mentor of mine until he passed away about 20 years ago. Now, Rick, as his friends called him, spent pretty much his whole career trying to understand what hope was and how it worked. And he knew if he wanted to create a model or definition of hope, that it was kind of a dead end to just ask people, because chances are if I asked every one of you right now, what does hope mean to you, you'd all give me a different answer. So instead what he did was he took a year and he did a very grassroots, informal research project. He went to leaders in the community. These were religious leaders, business leaders, educational leaders, lots of different kinds of leaders, and he asked them, using whatever definition of hope they wanted, to just give him the names of all of the most hopeful people they knew. And then during the next year, he approached everyone on that very hopeful list, and he talked to them. And he asked them simply, tell me how you think. Tell me how you think. And what he discovered was that all of these very hopeful people shared three things in common: goals, pathways, and agency. Now, Rick called these the three components of hope. But I've come over the years to call them the three conditions for hope to thrive, because it turns out, so says the research, that when people have these conditions set in their lives, they not only feel more hopeful, but they also have all kinds of other positive outcomes, which I'll talk about shortly. But first, let's just spend a minute or two with these three conditions. And what I love about these is they're not rocket science. They're actually really simple. But can we agree that it's often the simple things in our lives that we know we should do that we don't do? So as I'm going through each of these, I invite you to think about whether you have these conditions for hope to thrive set in your own life, starting with goals. So it's kind of no duh. In order to have hope thrive, you've got to start with something to hope for, a goal or goals. And it turns out, according to the research, that people who are very, very hopeful have lots of goals in their life. But really importantly, at least some of these goals are truly intrinsically meaningful to them. In other words, they're not things that they feel that they have to do or have to do for other people. They're things that they want to do for themselves because in some way it feels important or meaningful to them. So it's really important to think about that. Now, don't get me wrong. It's good to have goals that you have to do for other people. It's good to have responsibilities and fulfill those responsibilities. That's part of what makes the world go round. But nonetheless, we've learned from very hopeful people that it's also important to at least have some personal, intrinsic, meaningful goals for yourself. The second condition for hope to thrive is pathways. A pathway is simply a plan, a strategy, some way of getting from where you are to a goal that's important to you. So I think of this as kind of a mental map. If you ask people who are the most hopeful to close their eyes and tell you the route they're going to take to get to their goals, they can do that with pretty good detail. And really importantly, we know that the most hopeful people have backup plans for their backup plans. In other words, they realize that some of those routes, some of those pathways are likely to be blocked, so they tend to have alternative pathways just in case. And finally, the third condition for hope is agency. Agency is kind of a funky psychology term, but basically what it means here is the energy or the motivation that we need to go after our goals. And make no mistake, pursuing goals takes lots of energy. That agency can come from lots of sources. For some of us, it comes from our physical selves. It comes from eating a nutritious diet. It comes from getting enough sleep, getting enough exercise. For other people, not everybody, but for many people, it can come from their spiritual selves. So hearing an inspiring sermon, walking through a beautiful church or mosque or synagogue or temple, or even just sitting by the ocean and watching the waves lap up against the shore, all of these can be important sources of agency. Still, for others, the most important source of agency are the other people in our lives, those cheerleaders in our lives. You know who I'm talking about, those people who might believe in you even more than you do. For me, honestly, that's my father. Whenever I'm low in agency, I call him up and he can buoy up my sense of agency. But regardless of where it comes from, these are the three conditions for hope to thrive: goals, pathways, and agency. And like I said, there's now 30+ years of research, hundreds of studies, that show that when people have these three conditions set in their lives, they not only feel more hopeful, but they also have all kinds of other positive outcomes. So here's just a little about that. We know that people who habitually have these conditions set in their lives, I'm going to call those high hope people. experience lower levels of depression. And if we can take people who are depressed and we can help them set these conditions, even if only a little, it helps to alleviate that depression. We know that high hope people report that their lives feel more meaningful and more full of purpose. If they're in college, they tend to get better grades and drop out of school less often. Very importantly, for those of us who have encountered traumas or losses in our life, and I hate to tell you, but that's probably going to be all of us at some point in our lives. When people habitually have these three conditions for hope to thrive set, and then they encounter a trauma or a loss, they tend to cope a little better, and they tend to be a little more resilient. And finally, we have new research that shows that in people with very advanced cancers, people who have more hope actually tend to live longer. So lots of reasons to think that hope is a really, really good thing. Now, that last study that I mentioned, that I did with my colleagues Marie Bakaitis, Ben Korn, and others, we actually had data from 500 people with super advanced cancers. These are people that you could say had quote-unquote terminal cancers. And we found that hope predicted length of life. And it might be reasonable. You might ask, for instance, how could somebody with a terminal illness who has been through such dire circumstances have hope? It's a similar question that we asked about Alan Locke. Well, whenever I think about that question, one particular patient comes to mind. I'm going to call him Ned, change his name just to protect his confidentiality. I met Ned when he was around 70 years old, and he had just been admitted to inpatient hospice. You see, Ned had a terrible cancer that had spread throughout his body. They'd tried chemo, they'd tried radiation, none of it worked. And he and his doctor decided together to discontinue the curative treatments. And that's when I met him. The first thing I was struck by about Ned was actually his tremendous sense of humor. He loved to tell jokes. And in fact, one day he said to me, "You know, Dr. Feldman, I know 1,000 jokes." And then he smiled, this huge grin, and said, "And that doesn't count the dirty ones." So this gives you a sense of Ned's wicked sense of humor. In any case, one evening I happened into his room, and he had been crying, clearly. So I asked him, "You know, what's going on?" And he said that he was afraid that his jokes would die with him, that his grandkids wouldn't get to hear them. And so he and I put our heads together, and we decided that maybe one of the best ways to preserve his jokes was to write them down. So I went out, and I bought him a notebook, kind of a fancy one, nothing too expensive, and gave it to him. And a week later, he had filled every page of that notebook. So I bought him a second notebook, and this time, he got about a third of the way through before he became too shaky to write. So myself and the chaplain and the social worker on the unit took turns sitting by his bedside taking dictation. One day he came to us with an idea, and I thought, uh-oh, if Ned has an idea, we're all in trouble. But it was a great idea. He wanted to put on a stand-up comedy show, or as he called it, a lay-down comedy show, because he was bound to his bed, and again, his wicked sense of humor. Well, we thought it was a great idea. So for 3 days, he prepared and he prepared and he prepared. He even practiced in front of a mirror. And when the moment of the show arrived, we wheeled him out into the hallway. We were joined by staff, by patients, by family. And for 15 minutes, we all laughed and laughed and laughed. And I remember looking into Ned's eyes and seeing them beam with hope. And again, you could ask, what did this guy with a terminal illness have to be hopeful about? But if you think about it, in light of everything I've said today, didn't Ned, at that moment and the days leading up to that moment, didn't he have the three conditions set in his life? He had a goal that was really meaningful to him to preserve his jokes. He had pathways that he was pretty sure would work, whether that's writing them down or giving dictation or giving his stand-up comedy routine. And of course, he had lots of cheerleaders in his life to buoy up his agency. So Ned and Alan Locke both proved to me that it's possible to have hope even in really dire circumstances, even in really dire times. And I don't think it's any news to any of us to say that all of us, to one degree or another, right now, are living in really dire times. Whether we're talking about death, destruction, displacement, and war, whether we're talking about the terrible pandemic that we've just lived through, whether we're talking about the ongoing realities of racial and social injustice, of political bifurcation and political conflict, maybe we're talking about natural disasters, maybe we're talking about the slow-moving disaster of global warming, whatever it is, very few people would use the word hopeful to describe the times we're living in. Rather, for me personally, words like terrible and horrific come to mind. And yet I guess what I want to say to you before I end today is don't give up on hope. Don't give up on hope. No matter what's going on in your life personally for you, and there may be something really hefty going on in your own life, and even in the face of the horrors going on around the planet, and there are plenty of horrors, don't give up on hope. Please, please, please. You know, I've done hope research for many years, and people kind of know me as the hope guy. But I have to tell you, in the last few years alone, I've had more people than ever before come up to me and say they feel utterly hopeless. Utterly hopeless about their own lives, but also utterly hopeless, most importantly, about the state of our world, that we can never fix our world's many problems. And that, when I hear that, worries me. It worries me because if you think about it, isn't hope the psychological engine that drives our progress? Isn't hope what keeps us trying, even when things seem impossible? Isn't hope, and by that I mean goals, pathways, and agency, exactly what we need personally in our lives to set personal goals and move towards a better personal future? But isn't goals, pathways, and agency also what we need as a society to set goals to somehow fix our world? So I really worry about what happens when we writ large give up on hope. Are we giving up on one of the very psychological assets that in the long run could help save us? So don't give up on hope. Now, no part of me is pretending this is easy. And no part of me believes that having a little hope in our hearts is going to magically fix the world's problems. No way. But I want to end by quoting the great essayist and activist Rebecca Solnit, who once wrote, "Your opponents would love you to believe that it's hopeless. Your opponents, whoever or whatever they are, would love you to believe that it's hopeless, that you have no power, that there's no reason to act, that you can't win, but hope is a gift you don't have to surrender, a power you don't have to throw away." So as I end, I want to challenge all of you to think about ways both big and small that you can begin to set the conditions for hope to thrive. For yourselves, yes, but most importantly, for the people and communities around you. Maybe then, if all of us are able to do that in our own little ways, in our own little corners of the globe, we can begin little by little to move towards a better future. Thank you.